During the Second World War, I served in the 1st Canadian Division in a Highland Regiment. I was discharged from the Army in 1945, June the 1st. During that time, I served in England, Italy, Sicily, and France. I was 18 years old when I entered the service, and I had a part of high school. I don't fully remember, but I believe it was less than a year of high school. My rank was a corporal, but unfortunately I had a habit of maybe expressing my opinion. And so from time to time, I would be promoted and demoted. And so I guess they felt that I was too rebellious. So the height of my great achievement was a corporal. But what happened around 1943, before the invasion of Sicily, they decided to establish a new type of platoon. It was called an assault demolition platoon. This platoon's job was seeking out and delousing or undoing mines and booby traps. Our job was to sweep the roads at nighttime, go on patrols, clear out the minefields. Anytime we came across booby traps, tripwires, etc., that was my job. And if necessary, to blow pillboxes or railroad tracks or whatever. I worked with high explosives for the rest of the war. During the Second World War, up until 1944-43, everyone in the Canadian Armed Services was a volunteer. I was always very conscious of history, and I enjoyed ancient history, modern history, when I was a youngster. And so the prospect of seeing those great aerial dogfights I saw in the First World War, and the excitement of trench warfare and great bombardments, somehow they appealed to me. When I was in England in 1940, this was the year of the great German Blitz on London and the London area, and I was stationed outside of London in what we call the field. Our regiment was in the field. We were given leave to go to London for 7 days. And I can remember sitting out in the field one day hearing this terrible roaring sound, and looked up in the sky, and it was virtually black with German fighters and bombers. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere came the British Spitfires, and they engaged this mass of Germans in a horrendous air battle. But if ever I visioned hell, this was it. The whole areas were on fire. There were police cars, ambulances running everywhere. There was shrapnel falling from the sky from the Ack fire. There were bombs falling. You could hear them swishing down. It was unbelievable, and you may see in some of the wartime documentaries what it's like, but you'd have to experience that terrible heat, that fire, and realizing every stick of bombs, somebody was dying or losing their homes. It was one of the amazing parts of my life overseas. It was terrible, tasteless. We never had the K rations until later on in the war, but in the beginning we lived mainly on bully beef, canned soup, tea, a bit of jam. The jam was made out of terms with a plum flavoring. The food was basically porridge for breakfast, stewed, canned, roasted bully beef. If you've ever eaten bully beef, it comes in a can and it's 80% fat. I don't even want to think about that food today. No, I was a loner. I never made any really serious friends. I knew a lot of the chaps, and a lot of them, of course, were killed or wounded and went home. But I never really had any direct friendship or a pal, as you might call it. I don't know why. I guess I was strictly a loner. The main rumor we always got, mainly in Italy and Sicily, was that the Russians were advancing on all fronts, which didn't happen until about 1942, 43, when they really started to push the Germans back. But that was a constant rumor. Like, we never knew about D-Day until it physically happened, but the rumors always were that the Russians were moving ahead, and it always gave us a sense of thinking, well, they're going to win the war, part of the war with us, so at least we got someone there moving. But the fighting in Italy and Sicily was from mountain to mountain, from valley to valley, foot by foot. It was slogging in the cold and the wet and the rain sometimes, and very depressing. And so any type of rumor was great in those days. Worst experience I had during the war was the frontal attack on the Hitler line. Hitler line was right across Italy. It was a very powerful line the Germans built. It had built-in machine guns. It had cement walkways. It had artillery pieces dug in the ground. It had heavy amount of artillery and mortar positions behind it. And the attack went in late. Instead of going in early in the morning, we went in around 10 o'clock. Our tanks were all open. Tanks were getting hit everywhere. The wounded were crying for stretcher bearers. Shell fire coming down everywhere, mortars coming down, machine gun fire all around us. It was an experience that I was tempted almost to turn around and run. I was so terrified. But I knew my job as an assault pioneer, I had to keep going because I was told I had to blow the wire so the troops could get through the wire into the forward positions. But it lasted all day and part of that night and the next day. But that first frontal attack was so mind-boggling for me, so terrifying. I don't know how I ever made it. And that truly Scottish tradition, when you wear a kilt, you wear nothing under your kilt. That's a no-no. But unfortunately, I didn't follow the rules too well, and I did wear a pair of shorts under the kilt. But when I would get on the bus or streetcar, suddenly I'd feel a pinch. And I had an idea that these pinches were meant to see if I was wearing something under my kilt. But I assumed that's what they were trying to find out. But when I would turn around quick to see who it was, there would always be a couple of guys or a couple of girls behind me, so I never knew who did it. And I thought that was very ungentlemanlike, you know, during a time of war. One of the saddest moments for me during the war was we were in Ortona, and that's the city on the coast of Italy. We just captured Ortona, and the Germans knew where we were in all our positions. And every day around 3 or 4 o'clock, they would shell us with 88 millimeter guns. My platoon had an old bank building, and in this bank building there was a safe. And a couple of the two or three of the chaps were truly alcoholics, and they were into wine all the time. And they used to come up and stay in the basement when the Germans started to shell us, and they'd come up and get a bottle of wine out of the safe that was there. I was sitting there sewing my new stripe on it had on an old iron bed, and suddenly a shell hit a little window on the edge of the building. And 2 inches more and that shell would have came in the room and I would be dead. But it skipped and exploded on the window ledge, and it killed a good friend of mine in front of me, and it killed another young lad. Now what they do with these chaps when they're dead, we take them down to an old blown out building somewhere, and we use that for the morgue. But in the meantime, someone came in the building and said, there's a dead or dying Italian across the road, can someone help him? So myself and the Padre, that's a sky pilot, we ran across the road, and unfortunately the poor Italian civilian, he had a red scarf on. Most Italians wear red scarves, but he was bleeding at the mouth and the ears and nose, so we knew just he was gasping that he was dying, and he died. Well, I didn't know whether he had died. I just assumed that he had died. It was so bad. But I was corporal of the guard, so I had to go over to battalion headquarters, past this here morgue that we put our dead soldiers in, and on to battalion headquarters. Well, it was getting dusk, and I went down the street to do my duty at guard command headquarters. And as I come around the bend, I thought I better take a peek in. Just, I don't know why, it was a morbid thinking. See if my buddy was still there. And sure enough, there he was, stretched out on the floor. But beside him was this dead Italian civilian. And I thought, yeah, I guess he died. So I started back up the street toward the battalion headquarters. And as I started down the street, I saw a woman and a boy about, 10 or 11 years old standing in the doorway. And to this day, it burns in my mind, I knew for sure that was the father of and the husband of these two people. I don't know what it was, but I felt that's what it was. So I started up the street and I thought, it's a very narrow street, I'll ignore them, I'll go by them. But as I try to kind of look sideways and kind of squeeze by, the little boy said, "Excuse me," in Italian. And I didn't want to stop, but I stopped. And I said, "Yeah, what can I do for you," sort of. He said, "Mine papa niente ritorno. My father didn't come home." I knew a little Italian. And I said, "Well, what did he look like?" And he said, "A red scarf," which all Italians wear. And he described this man to a T. I knew that this was the mother and the son of that dead Italian civilian. So I knew I can't ignore them. I've got to tell them the truth and get the hell out of here. So I looked them straight in the face and I said, "See, Papa Morta in the casa. He's dead down in that building down the street." And the woman's tears streamed down her face, and the little boy, and this remains in my mind, that little boy put his arm around his mother and said, "Mia, Papa, now." And I can tell you, it was like someone kicked me in the stomach. I never had such a terrible feeling that I could never explain to myself long after the war. It still is as fresh as it was yesterday in my mind. I have no regrets, because when I realized that Hitler brought about the death of 55 million people, the terrible carnage at the concentration camps, the terrible bombings of London, and then again it led to the awful bloody mess in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor, Okinawa, terrible loss of lives. I feel truly that I did and should have done something to help. And but the only thing I felt good about the war is that at least I was there. I was no hero. I did my job, I did my volunteers, but I strictly just another guy like many millions doing what he had to do. Probably the most interesting thing that occurred, or that changed my outlook on life quite a bit. We were in Sicily, and we had just heavily bombarded a German position, and there were many, many Germans killed in that bombardment. When we moved into the town, we settled in, and I decided to scout around and see what was going on. The Germans had since pulled out. I walked down to a railway station where I saw it was sort of a fence, and there was a boot sticking out, a jack boot. It was the German soldiers' boot. They wore what we used to call jack boots. And I knew he was dead because it was very hot and the smell was very bad, so I fully realized that he was dead. But when I looked around the corner, there was a young German soldier sitting against the fence. And this picture remains in my mind to this day. He had his kneecap blown off, and he had his field dressing clamped over his kneecap, probably trying to stop the flow of blood. Then in his other hand, in his teeth, he had a piece of wood, and his teeth were sunk into that piece of wood probably a half an inch. You could clearly see his gums and his teeth right into this piece of wood. I assumed that when the terrible pain from that blow, that loss of that knee, must have been unbelievable. And when I looked closer, the back of his head was gone. A piece of shrapnel had finished him off. But in his right hand, he had a crucifix, beads and crucifix. I knew that he was a Christian, and I knew that this man probably had the same God as I had. For me to see that young soldier there, very young, with that crucifix and the beads, made me suddenly realize whose side was God on and why were we fighting. It remained with me for the rest of my life. The best memory of my war, after 5.5 years, we were preparing to go to France for to complete the ending of the war. Already the D-Day had taken place, and the armies and Allied armies were moving well into Germany, and they were moving all the armies from Italy to France. A corporal came over to me. I was laying in my bed and said, "Cromie, pack your bags, you're going home." For me, I'd made it through the war. I can't tell you the exhilaration, the feeling I had that it was over for me. I was away from the killing and the dying and the rain and all the terrible food. It was over for me, and I'd made it. I can never describe that wonderful feeling when he said, "Cromie, you're going home." I think war is a natural behavior of man, and I can give you physical evidence of that. In all life, everywhere around us, it's resistance against resistance. It's a natural fact of nature, whether it's up in the universe or in the bacterial world. There's one force against another force trying to produce the strongest of the species. That's my theme, because in Second World War, 55 million people died, plus millions and millions more were crippled, sick, permanently damaged for life, plus terrible material loss of life. Shortly after that, 45,000 American soldiers died in Korea. Nothing was gained by the Second World War. Shortly after that, 45,000 more Americans died in Vietnam. Now, that's only involving the Americans. I can go to other countries and talk about the brutal killing in Ireland. I can talk about the three-day wars in Israel, or the terrible desecration of life and property in many provinces and countries in Africa. It never ends, and it won't end, because man is part of nature, and its sole purpose is to survive under any means, any way. I would say today that you must face this. We live in a country where we have excellent laws, we have the right of speech, we have many things that give us a reason to be grateful. And I would say if the law of the land is conscription, or the law of the land says you must serve, then you must serve to preserve what we have and we know as the United States. There can be no escaping it. Regardless of your political or religious belief, you must contribute to that group that's going to keep us alive, keep us going as a wonderful nation.